Everyone remembers The Wizard of Oz as one of the warmest, most comforting films ever put on screen. The Golden Road, the singing scarecrow, the girl and her little dog. What almost nobody carries with them is that the making of the film nearly killed 2 performers, left a third scarred for weeks, exposed the entire cast to a known carcinogen on a daily basis, and placed its teenage lead on a pharmaceutical schedule that would follow her for the rest of her life. MGM still lost money on the first run. That gap between the image and the reality is what makes The Wizard of Oz one of the most compelling productions in Hollywood history. Not because it collapsed, but because it became a masterpiece by grinding through chaos, physical danger, and the systematic mistreatment of the person whose face ended up on every poster. The Wizard of Oz, released in August 1939, is the accidental icon, the misunderstood classic, a film that cost more than it earned, hurt nearly everyone involved in making it, and somehow became immortal anyway. Here's what actually happened. MGM greenlit The Wizard of Oz in 1938, riding the commercial momentum of Disney's Snow White, which had already proven that fantasy could reliably fill seats. The studio committed a production budget of $2,777,000, which adjusts to roughly $61 million in 2025 terms. That was serious money even for MGM, and the expectation behind it was a blockbuster. What the studio got, at least initially, was something closer to a controlled catastrophe. 4 directors rotated through the production in sequence. Norman Taurog, then Richard Thorpe, then George Cukor, and finally Victor Fleming, who took primary credit before being pulled away to rescue the troubled Gone with the Wind. King Vidor quietly directed the Kansas sequences and never received a formal credit for the work. At certain points during production, the film had been partially shot, partially scrapped, and partially reimagined so many times that nobody on the lot was entirely certain which version they were building toward. The instability at the top was never just a scheduling problem. Every incoming director carried a different vision, and those competing ideas left marks on the production that were more than administrative. Thorpe wanted Dorothy older, blonder, and more theatrical. Cukor pushed back towards something warmer and more grounded. Fleming held the balance between them. The version of Oz that ended up on screen is, in a very real sense, 3 different films stitched together under pressure, which makes the coherence of the finished product all the more improbable. That improbable stitching process is exactly what the next chapter gets into. Filming The Wizard of Oz from the inside looked nothing like the finished picture suggests, and the gap between those 2 realities is genuinely staggering. Start with the lighting rigs. 3-strip Technicolor in 1938 demanded so much artificial light it turned the sound stages into furnaces, and every cast member in heavy makeup and elaborate costuming spent hours baking under that heat each day. The performers playing the Munchkins, about 124 people recruited through a manager named Lou Singer, who reportedly collected a 50% commission on their earnings, were taking home between $50 and $100 a week depending on their individual roles. Terry the dog, who played Toto, earned $125 a week, paid directly to trainer Carl Spitz. The contrast between what the animal cost and what some of the human performers received tells you a lot about how MGM calibrated its priorities. Buddy Ebsen was the original Tin Man. He trained, rehearsed, and filmed early sequences before the aluminum powder in his makeup began coating his lungs, eventually landing him in a hospital in an oxygen tent. That was not a minor inconvenience on a production schedule. That was a performer's body failing because of what had been applied to his face for the role. Jack Haley replaced him. The makeup formula shifted from powder to aluminum paste, and Haley developed an eye infection from the paste. MGM kept filming. Margaret Hamilton's experience as the Wicked Witch was worse. During the Munchkinland departure sequence, pyrotechnics misfired, catching her costume and hat and burning her chin, nose, cheek, forehead, upper lip, and eyelid. She missed 6 weeks of production recovering from those injuries, and when she returned, she made one condition absolutely clear: no more fire effects involving her directly. Her stunt double Betty Danko inherited the fire sequences, and she was also injured during them. Honestly, looking at those broom effect sequences now carries a different weight once you know that detail. The poppy field snow was made from asbestos. That was standard industry practice at the time, and nobody on set would have understood it as a long-term health risk. By any modern measure, the cast and crew of The Wizard of Oz were breathing carcinogenic material on a soundstage in Culver City. The copper oxide in Hamilton's green makeup caused enough skin damage that recovery stretched for weeks after filming wrapped. Ray Bolger's scarecrow makeup regularly chapped and broke the skin on his face throughout production. Burt Lahr wore a cowardly lion costume constructed from an actual lion hide weighing approximately 90 pounds with almost no ventilation, and the garment had to be dried overnight each day because of the sweat it absorbed. The man spent the summer of 1938 slowly simmering inside a dead lion, which is either darkly funny or genuinely grim depending on your mood, but probably both. And sitting at the center of all of it was Judy Garland, who was 16 years old. Garland earned $500 a week during production. Ray Bolger and Jack Haley each collected $3,000 a week. Burt Lahr received $2,500 a week. Margaret Hamilton, carrying the burns and the weeks of skin damage and the toxic makeup, earned $1,000 a week. Garland, whose face became the face of the film and whose performance supplies the entire emotional spine of the picture, was paid roughly 1/6 of what her co-stars received for the same working hours on the same production. That pay gap reflects something structural about how the studio system processed Garland specifically. She was under contract, she was young, and the contracts of that era functioned as effective indenture agreements with very little recourse for the performer. Author and historian Aljon Harmitz captured the reality plainly. There were no unions at that time, and stars and lesser players were indentured servants for the studios. The toll went well beyond the paycheck. MGM maintained Garland on a managed schedule of stimulants to carry her through the long shooting days and sedatives to ensure she slept when the production schedule required it. She was dieting on studio instruction throughout much of the shoot, reportedly living on cottage cheese and chicken soup. Director Victor Fleming is documented as having physically confronted her on set during a scene he felt she was not treating with sufficient seriousness. She was 16 years old when this was happening. You would think the studio system's instinct toward its most commercially valuable young performer would at minimum run toward preservation, but the incentive structure pointed entirely the other direction. MGM owned the asset, and protecting it over a long horizon mattered considerably less than maximizing what it could produce right now. Here is the thing about all of that, and this is the part that stays with me. The film that came out of that process is genuinely beautiful. Garland's Dorothy is warm, specific, and emotionally real in ways that hold up across 8 decades without any erosion. The cruelty of the production is completely invisible in the finished film, and the suffering did not corrupt the work. Whether that reads as proof of Garland's extraordinary ability or as the most quietly devastating detail in the whole story probably depends on how you sit with it. The Gail Sondergaard casting situation deserves a pause here, because it illustrates exactly how differently the film could have landed. Before Margaret Hamilton entered the picture, Sondergaard was in discussions for the Wicked Witch role, envisioned at that stage as a glamorous and almost seductive villain drawn loosely from the Disney Evil Queen mold. When the creative direction shifted toward what the production documents called an ugly hag, Sondergaard withdrew from consideration. Hamilton was cast 2 days before filming started, and the green-faced witch she built, genuinely threatening and strange, has scared children continuously since 1939. Sondergaard walked away from one of cinema's most enduring villain roles because she objected to the costume specifications, and the door she left through is the one Hamilton stepped in. The financial picture on The Wizard of Oz at first release is worth sitting with for a moment because it reframes the entire story. The film earned approximately $3,017,000 in its initial domestic theatrical run, against a production budget of $2,777,000, which sounds like a marginal positive until you factor in MGM distribution and marketing costs, at which point the studio recorded a net loss of more than $1.1 million. One of the most celebrated films in American cinema history lost money the first time out. A 1949 re-release added approximately $1.5 million in additional revenue, which helped close the gap. But the real commercial turning point arrived when the film became a television institution. From 1956 onward, the annual CBS broadcast converted a financially struggling theatrical property into a genuine cultural ritual, and generations grew up watching it as a family event, which is a large part of why the film carries that particular warmth in collective memory, and why the production reality lands with such force by contrast. The ruby slippers have become the most concentrated symbol of the film's legacy, and their history is stranger than anything written into the script. In August 2005, a pair of the slippers was taken from the Judy Garland Museum in Grand Rapids, Minnesota by a man named Terry John Martin, who reportedly believed the shoes contained actual rubies, given that they were insured for $1 million. A fence informed him the stones were glass. The shoes vanished for 13 years, with the only physical evidence left at the scene being a single red sequin, which is either the most cinematic detail in the whole story or the most absurd, and again probably both. The FBI recovered the slippers through a sting operation in 2018. Martin was indicted in 2023, and he pleaded guilty that same year. In December 2024, that recovered pair sold at Heritage Auctions for a hammer price of $28 million or $32.5 million, including buyer's premium, setting an absolute record for entertainment memorabilia. A man discarded what he believed was worthless glass, and that glass became the most expensive piece of movie history ever sold at auction. For scale, the previous record belonged to Marilyn Monroe's white halter dress from The 7-Year Itch, which brought $5.52 million in 2011. The slippers exceeded that figure by more than 5 times. The Wicked Witch's hat sold at the same December 2024 Heritage Auctions event for $2.93 million, and that hat is scheduled to go back to auction in December 2025, with expectations running above the 2024 result. One separate pair of slippers resides permanently at the Smithsonian. Another pair, purchased for $2 million by Steven Spielberg and Leonardo DiCaprio, was donated to the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences and has been on display at the Academy Museum from October 2024 through July 2025. The Wizard of Oz received 5 Academy Award nominations for the 1940 ceremony, winning Best Original Song for Over the Rainbow and Best Original Score, with a special juvenile Oscar awarded to Garland. It lost Best Picture to Gone with the Wind, the same production that had taken its director mid-shoot. There is a certain symmetry in that outcome which nobody at MGM would have found particularly funny at the time. What The Wizard of Oz represents in the broader arc of Hollywood is a specific kind of accidental durability, mismanaged, undercompensated, physically dangerous, financially disappointing on its first outing, and built inside a system that processed its performers as contracted equipment rather than human beings. It has outlasted almost every other film from its era, and it did so not because of the system but despite it. The warmth that audiences carry when they think of that golden road came entirely from the performers. There was Garland's Dorothy, Bolger's Scarecrow, and Lar inside his 90-pound lion hide. They gave the film everything it has under conditions that returned considerably less to them. That is the film, that is the story. The slippers were always glass, and they were always worth a fortune. The kind of history that sits underneath finished films, the reality behind the image, is the territory this channel keeps returning to. If that interests you, there is more of it here.